The world of European culture. The objectives are: 1. Describe the artistic movements of Mannerism and the Baroque period of art, which began in Italy and reflected the spiritual perceptions of the time. And 2nd, identify Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes, prolific writers of dramas and comedies that reflected the human condition. Now, Mannerism really is an artistic movement that emerged in Italy in the 1520s and 30s and was itself a reaction to the decline of the medieval order that emerged and the eradication of the idea of Christian unity. Really, the world's enthusiasm for the Renaissance declined as people grew anxious and uncertain and wished for spiritual experiences. If you'll remember that Europe had really begun to shift and change in this tumultuous, chaotic time. The monarchs, as they knew it, were shifting, and there was war all over the place. People were searching for order. People were searching for a means by which to find stability. The dream of Christian unity had been eradicated, and now you saw competing narratives of religious authority. And so, really, we see the shift away from that Renaissance realism that emerged from the inspiration of the Greco-Roman traditions, and really see the intentional and deliberate refusal of focusing on the reality. The rules of proportion were deliberately ignored. And in fact, many were elongated, using elongated figures to really show suffering and heightened emotions and religious ecstasy. Here, in fact, depicted is a picture, a famous picture of the slaying of Saint Sebastian. Now, you see Saint Sebastian all over medieval art, and you see Saint Sebastian in Renaissance art. But here in Mannerism's approach is that we see the intentional distortion, elongation of his torso and his body, his neck, really characterizes the suffering and longing, the dark shadows behind. And we see his face looming and looking off in the distant, perhaps suffering, perhaps emotion-filled. Or indeed maybe just religious ecstasy as he is martyred. The concept here, though, is that under Mannerism, people like El Greco here depicted begin to express and embody the attitude of the time toward the political chaos and the religious chaos around them. And so El Greco used elongated and contorted figures, portrayed unusual shades of yellow and green, which really gave an eerie sense around the stormy grays that he is most famous for using. And so this Mannerism really captured the agony of the time. But of course, he wasn't the only voice. Inevitably, the Baroque period of art emerges as well. And Baroque artists really tried to bring together the classical ideas of the Renaissance art, but also gave it a spiritual feeling of religious kind of revival that emerged in the 16th century, the glory and power that people strived for and were looking for in absolutism and in the new religious movement, and really focused on dramatic effects to arouse emotions, usually to depict glory. You see this in architecture, art, music in general, paintings and sculptures. And this is most characteristic here in architecture and paintings, as we'll see in a minute, that it was really a search for power and glory, which was really seemed to be one of the major themes of the time. Now, one of the most famous people of this time that practiced this, at least in architecture, was Bernini, who completed St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, Bernini's Throne of St. Peter, adorned with gold and giant gold rays, as it seemed that the image of heaven and heaven's gates was opening right above St. Peter's medieval wooden throne, was quite emblematic of the Baroque attempt for power and glory. But we see this in other forms too. For example, Gentileschi's famous pictures and paintings of heroines from the Old Testament taking vengeance upon evil men. Here we see Judith beheading Holsfens, which at least it's said in tradition that she took vengeance upon a man whom raped her as a young girl. And so this was forever and perpetually characterized and depicted through her art, that she would perpetually put his face on the men being beheaded and her face on the women doing the beheading, forever immortalized. But the point here is the dark tones, the dramatic image, the vengeance, the power. That is the image of Baroque art. And it's quite jarring and stirring. But we see this, of course, in literature as well. A golden age had emerged across Europe in literature, perhaps even first starting with Shakespeare himself in England. Really, during this glorious golden age was really the reign of Elizabeth the Great. During this Elizabethan literature, you saw a glorious explosion of poetry and storytelling, not just of Shakespeare, but of others. But of course, he is really emblematic and characterized for the drama and image of the time. And really the energy and the verve and vigor of the time is really characterized with the drama, with the play, as professional playrooms begin to emerge. Shakespeare, of course, although best known for his plays, was also an actor and a shareholder in a chief theater company of the time, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and was quite prolific. But he is not the only voice in terms of the glorious kind of literature that is emerging at the time. This, of course, is true in Spain. You had touring companies that really brought plays throughout the Spanish Empire, and the literature that exploded through it have great famous works, particularly Cervantes and Cervantes' Don Quixote, one of the greatest literary works of all time. And Don Quixote is a standard which to be read, and in it he tells the story of a knight and his sidekick, Sancho Panza. Now, of course, interestingly enough, Sancho, being the sidekick, the assistant, is in fact the sane one, and the knight is somewhat insane, the dreamer, seeing things where they aren't there and chasing after them. But of course, Sancho is somewhat characterized and used to characterize the realities of hard work. Together, of course, they're a depiction of the human condition of the time, and a human condition of dreaming and very rooted, down-to-earth images. So you see this really characterization of the political tumultuous time going on. Now, of course, there are new political thoughts that begin to emerge as well. The English Revolution of the 17th century really had drawn out several new theories and ideas in England. And two major political figures are at least the thinkers, are really emblematic of this new shift. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, whom have completely different ideals toward the new trajectory that England should take. Now, first beginning with Hobbes, Hobbes argued that humans were guided not by reason, not by moral ideals, but by a ruthless struggle for self-preservation, that they really were after themselves and for the care of themselves. And so to restrain people required great power and force. In fact, rebellion must be suppressed and could likely only best be suppressed by a strong monarch. And so to Hobbes, such absolute power was needed to preserve order in society and could best be embodied around a strong monarch. Now, of course, for Locke, in his two treatises of government, he argued against the idea of absolute rule, at least the gathering of complete and total power to one king, one person. Locke believed that before society really began to organize and emerge, humans really lived in a state of equality and freedom with one another, and rather than the state of war in political entities. And in this state, they had certain natural rights. All humans did. And these natural rights, endowed by nature, by their creator, were ideas of the right to life, that one had a right to their own existence, that people had a right to liberty, their own freedoms, and people had a right to have their own property. And so the idea here was that these three things were innately theirs. They weren't given to them by government, they weren't given to them by a king, but was innately theirs. And so the concept becomes, well, why does the government tend to think that they are the ones who give these things? In fact, he argues that people found it difficult to protect their natural rights as other people tries to seize their natural rights from them. And so for that reason, they agreed to establish a government, a political organization, to ensure the protection of their rights, which is a completely different philosophical idea than what had come before. Before, we saw the idea that the kings were the ones who gave the authority and the rights to their citizens. But here, under Locke's ideas, he says, look, these are innately ours, and the government was established to protect our rights, not to give our rights. And so, while Locke was no fan of democracy by no means, his ideas become foundational to the establishment of the American democracy and also the French Revolution. And really, these ideas, though different in their embodiment in the long run, were incredibly influential on the 18th century and forward. So then, to refresh then, our objectives were, 1, describe the artistic movement of Mannerism and the Baroque art period, which began in Italy and reflected the spiritual perceptions of the time. And 2, identify Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes, prolific writers of dramas and comedies that reflected the human condition.